To the Miller family, Kenji was nothing more than a cripple. A broken, one-armed alien, standing on the wrong side of the fence, clutching a duffel bag and a naive hope. They looked at his purple heart and saw only weakness, convinced that a stroke of a pen and a corrupt sheriff were enough to crush him. They didn't just steal his land. They tried to erase his soul. They locked his parents in a desert camp, painted over his family name, and laughed while they harvested the fruit of his father's labor. They thought they could bury his legacy under a pile of legal paperwork and rural prejudice. That was their fatal mistake. They forgot that Kenji didn't leave the war behind in Europe. He brought it home with him. They thought they were bullying a helpless farmer, but they were actually poking a sleeping tiger from the legendary 442nd. The man standing at their gate wasn't looking for charity. He was scouting for a kill zone. They thought they were planting a new empire on stolen ground, but they just dug their own graves. The train shuddered to a halt, a final weary sigh of grinding metal and escaping steam. Kenji Ishikawa, Private First Class, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, pushed himself from the window seat, the phantom ache in his missing right arm a familiar companion to the weight of his duffel bag. His uniform, still crisp despite the journey from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, felt less like a testament to valor and more like a costume. On his chest, a freshly pinned purple heart glinted under the anemic station lights of Fresno, California, a stark counterpoint to the hollow cavity in his soul. He stepped onto the platform, the warm California air a faint, teasing memory of home. It carried the familiar, sweet promise of orange blossoms, a scent he'd craved through freezing foxholes and the stench of gunpowder and blood. But tonight, the perfume was thin, almost spectral, overshadowed by an unsettling stillness. The usual bustle of homecoming soldiers and tearful reunions was muted, sparse. A few families embraced, but their joy felt tentative, muted, like a chord played on a broken string. Kenji had no one waiting. His parents were still elsewhere. His boots, polished to a mirror sheen, crunched on the gravel as he left the station, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, awkward with only one arm. He ignored the curious, sometimes wary, glances from the few passers-by. A Japanese-American in uniform, bearing the scars of a war fought for a country that had locked his own people away, was a complicated sight. The irony was a jagged shard he carried close to his heart. The familiar path to his family's farm was overgrown in places, the roadside weeds taller than he remembered. He walked past vineyards he'd known since childhood, past fields where he'd helped his father plant and harvest, past the creek where he'd learned to fish with his older brother, Taro. Each step was a measured beat, a silent prayer that the unease tightening in his gut was nothing more than exhaustion and the trauma of memory. Then he saw it. The old wooden gate, once lovingly repainted every spring by his father, was gone. In its place stood a crude, unpainted post, hammered into the earth, bearing a freshly painted sign. The characters were stark, black against white, jarringly new. Miller's Orchard. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, a concussive shock that stole the air from his lungs. Miller's, not Ishikawa, not the sprawling acres of oranges his grandfather had planted, nurtured through droughts and freezes, passed down through generations. Not the soil he'd tilled, the trees he'd pruned, the fruit he'd picked, season after tireless season. A cold, unfamiliar rage, far more potent than any battlefield fury, began to simmer in his veins. He pushed through a makeshift barbed wire fence, his good hand fumbling with the latch. The familiar scent of orange blossoms here was overwhelming, cloying, like perfume on a corpse. His trees looked different, pruned aggressively, perhaps, or merely seen through the lens of a stranger's ownership. As he approached the farmhouse, a light flickered on inside. The porch swing, where his mother used to sit, humming folk songs, was now piled high with old tools, rusted and forgotten. The window boxes, once overflowing with his grandmother's prized petunias, were empty, filled only with dry, brittle soil. The front door creaked open. A man, burly and unshaven, with a shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm, squinted out into the twilight. Behind him, a woman with tight, suspicious eyes hovered. "Can I help you?" the man grunted, his voice laced with rural suspicion. Kenji straightened, his uniform suddenly feeling less like a shield and more like a target. "This is the Ishikawa farm," he stated, his voice tight, rough from disuse and rising anger. "My name is Kenji Ishikawa. I live here." The man let out a short, guttural laugh. "Not anymore, sonny. This here is Miller's Orchard. Has been for nearly 3 years now." He shifted the shotgun, the metallic click echoing in the unsettling quiet. "Where are my parents?" Kenji demanded, taking a step forward. The woman gasped, pulling back further into the shadows. The man's expression hardened. "Relax, soldier boy. No need to get feisty. Your folks are where all the other Japs went. Manzanar, ain't it? Hell, they're probably better off there, protected." He sneered, a cruel twist of his lips. "Least that's what the government said when they sold us the land. Sold them the land." The phrase hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. Kenji felt a tremor run through him, a white-hot spark igniting a long-dormant fuse. "Sold?" he repeated, the word a rasp. "This land has been in my family for 50 years. You can't just sell it. Wartime Emergency Act, sonny." The man, Miller said, a glint of perverse satisfaction in his eyes. "Your folks were declared non-resident aliens. Even if they were born here, government took over. Deemed it abandoned property. We bought it fair and square. Paperwork's all legal. Got the sheriff to prove it." The world tilted. Kenji swayed, not from weakness, but from the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie, the injustice masquerading as law. His parents, citizens trapped in a desert camp, their land stolen by the very government he had bled for, had lost an arm for. He turned on his heel, the smell of orange blossoms now truly sickening. He would not stand here and beg for what was rightfully his. He would not give them the satisfaction. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building, smelling of stale coffee and desperation. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, barely looked up from his newspaper when Kenji recounted the miller's claim. "Ishikawa, you say?" Brody mumbled, not unkindly, but with a weary finality. "Yeah, I remember your family. Good people. Hard workers." He sighed, folding the paper with a slow deliberation that spoke of a practiced reluctance. "Look, son, it's all on the books. Executive Order 9066. Federal government stepped in, took over properties of Japanese Americans in designated zones, deemed them strategic assets or some such nonsense. They were leased, then in some cases, sold for public benefit to cover administrative costs and to prevent economic destabilization of the region. My family wasn't destabilizing anything." Kenji slammed his good hand on the counter. The chief wood groaned. "They were growing food for this country, Sheriff, while I was fighting for it." Brody held up a placating hand. "I know, son, and we're grateful for your service. But the law's the law. The Millers bought it from the government, clear title. Nothing I can do. You'd have to take it up with the feds, and good luck with that." The words were a dismissal, a door slamming shut not just on his claim, but on his hope, his sense of belonging. The sheriff's gaze, though sympathetic, held the chilling indifference of a system that had found its scapegoats and then sold off their lives like chattel. Kenji walked out, the California sun now in a front, its golden rays illuminating a landscape utterly scarred. He looked at his Purple Heart, the metal a burning brand on his chest. He had offered his body, his future, for a country that had taken everything from his family, their freedom, their livelihood, their home. They had imprisoned his parents behind barbed wire, stolen their ancestral land, and handed it to strangers while he lay bleeding in a French ditch. A silence settled over him, deeper and colder than any he had known in the war. The simmering rage beneath his skin found its focus, sharpening into a single, unbreakable resolve. He clenched his lone fist, the scar tissue on his shoulder throbbing with a phantom ache. This was not over, not by a long shot. He would not go back to Manzanar to wait for his family. He would not write letters to federal agencies that had already condemned them. He would not simply accept this bitter harvest. He made a vow, silent and dark, etched into the very core of his being. He would reclaim every inch of what was stolen. He would make them regret the day they dared to plant their flag on Ishikawa soil. The 442nd had been trained to fight to the last man. Kenji Ishikawa, The last man of his family's generation on this land was just getting started. The lawyer's office smelled of stale cigar smoke and the weight of forgotten injustices. Mr. Henderson was a man built of shadows and sighs, his gray suit rumpled, his face a map of weary cynicism. He sat behind a desk cluttered with dusty tomes and framed photographs of a life that looked happier, younger. Kenji, still wearing the uniform he'd arrived in, felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, a hollowness that even the roar of artillery couldn't create. This quiet defeat was a different beast entirely. Ishikawa, Henderson began, his voice gravelly, his eyes the color of diluted coffee. He gestured vaguely at a stack of documents. I've looked over your parents' deed, the original purchase agreements, and the subsequent acquisition by the Millers. He paused, picking up a pen and twirling it between arthritic fingers. It's boilerplate, son. Heartbreaking boilerplate. Kenji leaned forward, his lone hand clenching, the phantom ache in his shoulder a dull counterpoint to the sharp anxiety in his gut. But it was their land. They worked it for decades. My father built that farm with his own hands. Henderson sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the sorrows of generations. Legally, Mr. Ishikawa, your father, like many Issei, was an alien ineligible for citizenship. The Alien Land Law of 1913, and its subsequent amendments, prohibited non-citizens from owning agricultural land. He leaned back, the springs of his chair groaning in protest. To circumvent this, land was often purchased in the names of their American-born children, the Nisei. Like you. Kenji nodded, remembering the complex arrangements, the whispers of his parents about protecting their future. He was only a boy, but he understood the fierce, quiet pride his father took in that small patch of fertile earth. Your father purchased the land in your name when you were 7, Henderson continued, tapping the documents. A perfectly legal transaction at the time. However, when Executive Order 9066 came down, and mass hysteria took hold, things changed. Henderson's gaze softened, a flicker of genuine sympathy in his tired eyes. The state seized these properties, often under the guise of abandonment or enemy alien property. They were sold, many at distressingly low prices, or through what were effectively forced liquidations, to ensure they wouldn't sit unmanaged while the owners were away. Away, Kenji repeated, the word tasting like ash. His parents were not away. They were imprisoned. The Millers, a prominent local family, acquired your family's land through a public auction facilitated by the Wartime Civil Control Administration's Liquidation Division. Henderson stated, his voice devoid of emotion, just the cold recitation of facts. All perfectly legal, according to the letter of the law that was in place at the time. The courts have upheld these sales repeatedly. The system, Mr. Ishikawa, was designed to dispossess. And it worked beautifully. Kenji felt a cold dread settle over him. So there's no recourse? No way to challenge it. Henderson rubbed his temples. A few cases have tried. Oyama versus California offered a glimmer of hope for some Nisei veterans, but it didn't overturn the Alien Land Law, only narrowed its application regarding specific conveyances to minors. It hasn't helped families reclaim land already sold. The legal precedent is firmly against you, I'm afraid. Every judge, every jury, they'll see an alien son trying to reclaim land from a patriotic American family who bought it in good faith. Even with your uniform, your Purple Heart, it won't matter to the law. The words struck Kenji like a physical blow. He had fought and bled for this country, for its laws, its ideals. And now, those same laws were being used to sanction the theft of his family's legacy. The law of the land was just another weapon, aimed squarely at people like him. Leaving Henderson's office, Kenji felt a chilling despair. He drove to the nearest post office, sending letters to Manzanar, to the address his parents had given him. Weeks passed, each day stretching into an eternity of unanswered questions. Then, a thin envelope arrived, its surface marred by heavy black redactions. Dearest Kenji, it began, the rest of the first paragraph a thick, censor's blot. We are well. Your sisters miss you. The dust never stops. Stay strong. Love, mother and father. The words, what little remained, were a code. The dust wasn't just physical. It was the dust of their lives, slowly eroding behind barbed wire. The black ink on the page was a shroud, covering not just words, but their very souls. It was a stark reminder that even communication was a luxury, controlled and curated by those who had stripped them of everything else. He spent the next few days driving, seeking out other Japanese-American communities, ghost towns of shattered dreams. He saw families huddled in hastily erected shacks, farming what little land they could lease, or scraping by with menial jobs. Their eyes held a familiar mix of resilience and deep-seated fear. He spoke to men who had returned from fighting in Europe, only to find their families dispossessed, their homes gone, their communities scattered. They shared stories of bureaucratic stonewalling, legal dead ends, and the silent, pervasive prejudice that still clung to them like the dust of the Central Valley. One grizzled veteran, his uniform patched and faded, spat on the ground. "They gave us medals for dying, Kenji, but they won't give us back what's ours." The anger, dulled by the lawyer's pronouncements, now flared anew, hotter, sharper. He felt like an outsider in his own country, a pariah in a land he had helped defend. He returned to his makeshift shelter, a lean-to fashioned from salvaged wood and canvas near the edge of his family's former acreage. It was a defiant act, a small, pathetic claim to a past that was being systematically erased. He stared across the fields, the verdant rows of crops now belonging to the millers, the fruit of his family's sweat harvested by strangers. A formal envelope, stark white against the deepening twilight, was pinned to his lean-to's rough door. Kenji tore it open. It was an eviction notice, cold and impersonal, from the Miller family. It cited trespassing, property damage, and a clear directive to vacate the premises within 24 hours. "Your presence constitutes a nuisance and a threat to our property and peace of mind. Any failure to comply will result in immediate legal action and forcible removal." The words were a calculated slap, an assertion of absolute dominion. They weren't just taking his land. They were taking his right to even exist near it. The Millers hadn't just bought the land. They had bought the very air around it. Kenji crumpled the notice in his hand, the paper tearing with a sound like a scream. The system, the courts, the laws, the very fabric of American justice he had sworn to protect, had not only failed him but actively conspired against him. It wasn't merely injustice. It was a weaponized bureaucracy designed to crush the spirit. He looked across the moonlit fields, at the distant lights of what used to be his home, now belonging to the Millers. The uniform he still wore felt like a mocking costume. The legal path was a labyrinth with no exit, a wall of paper designed to keep him out, to keep him powerless. A different kind of instinct began to stir within him, an old primal language he'd learned in the snow-dusted mountains of Italy. When the rules crumbled, when the law became a tool of oppression, there was only one law left. The law of the jungle. He traced the outline of his Purple Heart, then the faint scar tissue above his elbow where his other arm had once been. The 442nd never retreated, and Kenji Ishikawa had run out of avenues of retreat. He would not be forcibly removed. He would not be dispossessed again. The Millers had sown their bitter harvest. Now he would begin to reap his own. He stood, a singular shadow against the vast, indifferent California sky, and started to walk, not away, but deeper into the darkness beyond the property line, toward something far more dangerous than any lawyer's letter. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, barely illuminating the familiar contours of the land Kenji Ishikawa had known since birth. He moved like a ghost, a phantom limb of the 442nd, slipping through the pre-dawn silence. Every rustle of dry leaves underfoot, every snap of a twig, was an insult to his training, a potential betrayal. He compensated for the missing arm with a fluid, almost balletic shift of his weight, his remaining hand often brushing the ground for balance, feeling the rough texture of the soil he now treated as enemy territory. He passed the old stone marker at the property line, half hidden by overgrown weeds. It was a line drawn by men in suits, not by the earth itself. On the other side lay the orchard, stretching out in perfect, geometric rows. His orchard. The scent hit him first. The faint, sweet perfume of ripening apricots, mingling with the earthy tang of damp soil and something else, something foreign. It was the smell of careless ambition. He saw the Millers' makeshift camp near the packing shed, a constellation of harsh LED lights cutting through the darkness, their generators humming an industrial lullaby that grated on Kenji's nerves. He could see their figures moving, dim shapes against the artificial glow, already harvesting. A profound violation twisted his gut, a cold, sharp knife. These hands, clumsy and unpracticed, were touching the fruit his father had nurtured, fruit grown from the very essence of generations of Ishikawa care. He remembered his father, stoic and strong, teaching him to prune, his weathered hands guiding Kenji's youthful ones. Each cut, son, is a promise to the future, a respect for the past. The words echoed in the chill air, a ghost of a whisper carried on the breeze that now stirred the leaves. His mother's voice, a soft, lilting melody, would often drift through these rows at dusk, a Japanese lullaby sung to him as he fell asleep in the shade of the oldest peach tree. He could almost hear it now, rising above the grind of the miller's machinery, a lament for what was lost. The trees themselves seemed to weep, their branches heavy with the weight of stolen fruit, their ancient roots feeling the tremors of unfamiliar feet. He found what he was looking for in the far corner, near where the creek used to swell in winter. The millers had cleared a section, replacing a small stand of gnarled cherry trees with rows of young, spindly avocado plants. Non-native, water-intensive, and utterly out of place. A monument to their presumption. The irrigation manifold was a crude affair, a series of PVC pipes running off the main line, secured with cheap plastic clamps. Kenji knelt, his silhouette melting into the shadow of an apricot tree. His good hand, calloused from rifle grips and farm work, moved with practiced ease. He pulled a small, multi-tool from his pocket, the metal cool against his skin. A snip of wire, a twist of a valve, a precise, calculated cut to a feeder line. Water would still flow to the original trees. He would not punish the land, but this new, invasive species would slowly, imperceptibly begin to wither. A silent protest, a slow-acting poison. No explosions, no overt violence. Just a whisper of sabotage, a reminder that the land itself had memory, had an allegiance. As he finished, he reached into another pocket, retrieving a small, neatly folded object. It was a paper crane, pure white, its delicate wings creased with perfect symmetry. His mother had taught him to fold them when he was a boy, for good luck, for peace, for healing. Now it was a message. He made his way to the miller's temporary dwelling, a large, prefabricated structure that stood insultingly close to where his own home once stood. The porch light was off, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and unwashed bodies. He climbed the steps without a sound, placed the crane precisely in the center of the welcome mat, its wings catching a faint sheen from the distant orchard lights. Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows, a specter of defiance. The sun was barely kissing the horizon when he settled into his new observation post, a hidden alcove in the dense chaparral on the bluff overlooking the entire property. From here, he could see everything. A few hours later, Kenji watched as a heavy-set man, presumably Mr. Miller, emerged from the prefab. He was in work boots and stained overalls, grumbling, a half-eaten bagel in his hand. He stepped onto the porch and almost immediately, his foot nudged the paper crane. Miller paused, squinting down at it. He bent curious, then picked it up, his brow furrowed. He turned it over in his rough hands, clearly baffled. He glanced around, an instinctive, uneasy sweep of his gaze, then crumpled the delicate paper into a tight ball and tossed it into the dust. Kenji's jaw tightened. Moments later, a woman, Mrs. Miller, came out, yelling about breakfast. "What's this?" Miller asked, gesturing vaguely. "Some kind of weird kid's toy? Thought I saw something moved here." Mrs. Miller barely glanced. "Probably just some trash blown in. Get back to work. Harvest won't do itself." They were oblivious, but Kenji saw the flicker of annoyance, the seed of unease. A small victory. He watched them move about, saw their routines begin to solidify. The younger Miller boy, Pete, a lanky teenager, was responsible for the irrigation. Kenji noted his habit of checking the main lines every morning, but rarely venturing to the far corners. Good. The new avocado plants would suffer for days before anyone noticed. He mapped their every move, the specific times they started and stopped work, the pattern of their lunch breaks, the frequency of their trips into town for supplies, the almost ritualistic way Mr. Miller walked the northern perimeter fence just before dusk. He noted the placement of their tools, the routes of their trucks, the casual disregard for security. There were no dogs, no cameras, just a presumption of rural peace that Kenji was about to shatter. He was no longer just an ex-soldier, an injured man. He was an observer, a strategist, a hunter. And the Millers, so confident in their legal victory, so blind in their ignorance, were now his prey. As the sun climbed higher, Kenji sketched a crude map in a small notebook, marking positions, timings, vulnerabilities. He circled one particular entry with a deliberate stroke. The Millers had recently acquired a small, expensive-looking drone, buzzing occasionally over the fields, ostensibly for crop monitoring. But Kenji had seen the gleam of its camera, the way it sometimes hovered near the edge of the property, pointed towards the old Ishikawa house, now empty. A chill, not from the wind, ran down his spine. The drone wasn't just for surveillance. It was a taunt. It was looking for him. He was no longer just hiding. He was being hunted. And the next move, he knew, had to be a masterstroke. The humming of the drone, a wasp-like buzz against the dawn's cool silence, was Kenji's alarm clock. It wasn't directly overhead, not yet, but its presence was a constant, irritating thrum that burrowed beneath his skin. They were looking for him. Or, more accurately, they were looking for something. He just had to make sure they found what he wanted them to find. His first move was a whisper, not a shout. He watched Mr. Miller, predictably, head for the small shed where the irrigation tools were kept. Kenji had already been there the night before. The rusted spanner, the precise wrench for the main valve, the coil of sturdy twine all gone. He waited, his breath held, for the inevitable shout of frustration. Came sharp and clipped, carried on the breeze. Mr. Miller spent a good 15 minutes rummaging, his face reddening, before giving up and grabbing a less suitable, heavier tool. Later that morning, as Mrs. Miller struggled with a stubborn hose connection, Kenji placed the spanner precisely where she had just searched, on the dusty workbench, gleaming faintly in the shed's gloom. Not hidden, not obvious, just there. Her gasp, a small startled sound, was his reward. She looked around, her eyes wide, before snatching the tool as if it might vanish again. The gates were next. The heavy metal latch on the north pasture, a clunky mechanism Mr. Miller always secured with a double twist, was found open one morning. 2 of their prize heifers had wandered into the avocado grove, delicately browsing the leaves of the younger trees. Mr. Miller's anger was a predictable explosion, but Mrs. Miller's reaction was more unsettling. "But I saw you latch it last night, dear," she insisted, her voice tight with a peculiar tremor. "You always do." "And I did," Mr. Miller snapped, wrestling with a recalcitrant heifer. "Someone just didn't do it right, or the damn thing came loose." He shot a suspicious glance towards the distant road, a habit Kenji was beginning to notice. He was looking for a person, an intruder. Kenji intended to make him look for a ghost. The old barn, a skeleton of sun-bleached wood and corrugated iron, became Kenji's stage at night. Its loose panels and rotting beams were perfect for generating an orchestra of disquiet. A subtle shift of weight on the old hayloft sent a chorus of groans and creaks echoing through the night. A carefully nudged barrel rolled with a hollow thud, the sound amplified by the stillness. He even jury-rigged a loose sheet of tin with a thin wire, allowing him to create a rhythmic, almost breathing thwack-thwack-thwack from a distance. Mrs. Miller heard it first. She'd wake, staring into the darkness, her heart hammering. "Did you hear that?" she'd whisper, nudging her husband. "Hear what, Martha? Go back to sleep. The barn. There's something moving out there." "It's the wind, Martha." Old barns creak. But the wind didn't leave the barn door slightly ajar when they were sure they'd closed it, or move the rusted old wheelbarrow from its usual resting place to directly outside their kitchen window, its single squeaky while pointing accusatorily towards their home. The subtle shifts were like pinpricks, too small to truly sting, but numerous enough to create a spreading rash of unease. The crops were the most insidious. Kenji knew the rhythms of growth, the delicate balance of a healthy plant. In the remote avocado sections, far from the house and any regular patrols, he worked under the cover of night. He didn't hack or burn. Instead, he meticulously identified the youngest, most vulnerable plants. A small incision at the root crown, just enough to invite fungal infection. A carefully administered spray of dilute herbicide, enough to stunt growth over weeks without immediately killing the plant. a strategic loosening of drip lines that would lead to uneven watering and eventual stress. The damage wouldn't be apparent for days, perhaps weeks, even to a trained eye. It would look like disease, like environmental stress, like bad luck. He watched the drone's flights. It never came close to his hiding spots. It usually swept the fields, then lingered near the old Ishikawa land, almost as if it was waiting for him to appear. This gave him an idea. He began leaving small, almost invisible markers in the far corners of their property. A piece of twine tied to a low branch, a stone placed on a fence post signs of human interference that would be obvious to a ground search, but not to an aerial camera sweeping from hundreds of feet up. He wanted them to think someone was walking their land unseen. One evening, after unlatching the gate to the chicken coop and watching the startled hens scatter in the half-light, Kenji found himself leaning against the trunk of an ancient oak, his chest tight. The sounds of Mr. Miller shouting at Mrs. Miller, blaming her for forgetting to latch the coop, carried across the twilight-filled fields. Mrs. Miller's voice was high-pitched, almost a sob. "I didn't forget, Arthur. I closed it. I know I did. There's something wrong, I tell you. This farm, it feels wrong." A cold knot tightened in Kenji's stomach. This wasn't the clean, surgical strike he'd envisioned in his military days. This was petty, cruel even. He was twisting their minds, chipping away at their sanity. Is this what I've become? He wondered, the thought a bitter taste on his tongue. Am I stooping to their level or lower? The dishonor of it pricked at him. His parents, steeped in their traditions, would have found this psychological warfare beneath him. He retreated to his small, hidden alcove, the damp earth cool beneath his fingers. He pulled out the worn, creased envelope, its edges softened by countless readings. Inside, folded carefully, was the letter from his mother. The paper was thin, the ink faded in places, but her elegant script was still clear. "My dearest Kenji," it began. "We received your last message. Your father and I pray for your safe return every day. The farm, it suffers without you. But we will wait. We will rebuild. We will make it bloom again, as it did for generations before us. Never forget who you are, my son. Never forget what this land means to us. It is our past, our future, our very soul. Come home, Kenji. We dream of your return, of a future where we reclaim what is rightfully ours." He traced the delicate characters, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. Never forget what this land means to us. It is our past, our future, our very soul. The words were a bomb, a fire. This wasn't about petty revenge. This was about reclaiming a soul. This was about justice. His methods, however unsavory, were a means to an end, a weapon in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into his jacket pocket, his resolve hardening. The Millers were growing paranoid, just as he intended. But paranoia was a slow burn. He needed to accelerate it. He needed to make them question not just their sanity, but their security. And he knew exactly how. The drone. It had been a taunt, a symbol of their superiority. He would make it their vulnerability. Tomorrow the game would shift. Tomorrow he would make his presence felt not just as a ghost, but as a deliberate, calculating force. Tomorrow their surveillance would become their blind spot. He had seen the way the drone's battery depleted after an hour, the specific tree it returned to, high above the main house, to exchange its power pack. He smiled, a dark, grim expression in the fading light. He knew what he had to do. The harvest wasn't just of avocados. It was a harvest of fear, and Kenji was just getting started. The drone was gone. Not crashed, not discovered, just gone. One moment, it had hovered, a mechanical predator surveying its domain. The next, its familiar whirring ceased, a silent, almost elegant plunge into the thick avocado canopy where its plastic shell would blend seamlessly with the detritus of the jungle-like grove. Kenji had replaced the power pack with a meticulously crafted decoy, a casing filled with sugar water and a tiny, dissolving chip designed to short-circuit the drone's internal systems on contact with moisture. A little rain, a little dew, and the drone would simply cease to be, its demise utterly untraceable, a phantom error in the vast digital matrix. It was a small victory, a silent testament to Kenji's precision, but his mind was already moving past such minor distractions. Today he needed a different kind of truth. He found Mateo at the edge of the oldest grove, where the gnarled avocado trees stood like silent sentinels, their roots clinging stubbornly to the earth. Mateo, a man whose skin was etched with a lifetime of sun and toil, was methodically pruning low-hanging branches, his movements slow but sure. He was one of the few remaining workers who'd been on the land before the war, before the millers. Kenji approached him carefully and offered bottle of cold water a silent overture. "Hola, Mateo," Kenji said, his voice soft, almost deferential. Mateo grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. His eyes, the color of rich earth, were wary, flicking to Kenji then sweeping the surrounding trees as if expecting an unseen observer. "Kenji-san," he replied, accepting the water with a nod. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic snip of Mateo's shears the only sound. Kenji allowed the quiet to stretch, understanding that trust, like the roots of these ancient trees, needed time to grow. Finally, Kenji spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My parents, they spoke highly of you, of your family." Mateo paused, his shears resting. He looked at Kenji, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Good people, hard workers, like you. They told me a little about the lease, before they left." Kenji chose his words carefully, navigating the unspoken dangers that still lingered in the air around the miller's operations. That it was temporary, a way to protect the farm. Mateo's jaw tightened. He resumed pruning, but his movements were now jerky, less fluid. The air around them grew heavy with unspoken history. "Temporary?" he repeated, the word laced with bitter irony. "That's what they said." "Who, Mateo?" Kenji pressed gently, his heart thrumming. He knew the answer, but he needed to hear it, to see the admission in Mateo's eyes. Mateo stopped again, turning fully to Kenji. His eyes, usually clouded with resignation, held a spark of defiance, quickly extinguished by fear. He glanced around once more, then leaned closer, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The Millers, Thomas Miller and his father before him, they came to the camp, to Manzanar, said the government would seize the land if no one was here to manage it, offered to help your family, to keep it safe until after the war." Kenji felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "And my parents, they signed a lease?" Mateo nodded slowly, his gaze distant, haunted. "Not a sale, a lease, a temporary arrangement. They were desperate, Kenji-san. Your father, he was sick. Your mother, she was terrified. For you, for the land. They had no choice, no power. The Millers, they knew this. They pushed, said it was for the best, for your own good. A lie, all lies." The words hung in the air, a sickening revelation. Not just a legal seizure, but a calculated, predatory act of coercion. Kenji's grip tightened on the water bottle, his knuckles white. The injustice burned, a white-hot ember in his chest. His parents, imprisoned, vulnerable, had been preyed upon by these vultures. "Thank you, Mateo," Kenji said, his voice thick with emotion. Mateo simply nodded, his eyes filled with a shared sorrow. The truth, a bitter harvest, now fueled Kenji's resolve. The Millers hadn't just taken the land. They had stolen hope under the guise of benevolence. Later that afternoon, the quiet hum of the Miller's high-tech avocado harvesting machine was abruptly shattered. It wasn't a gentle sputter, or a gradual decline. It was a guttural, mechanical shriek that tore through the air, followed by a sickening crunch and then an agonizing, grinding silence. The harvester, a monstrous piece of equipment vital for the day's operation, shuddered to a halt, its primary drive belt shredded, tangled around a mangled pulley wheel. A shower of fresh, green avocados, destined for the conveyor, cascaded to the ground, bruised and wasted. Chaos erupted. Workers scrambled back, some shouting in Spanish, others simply staring in disbelief. Thomas Miller, overseeing the operation from a nearby ATV, leaped off, his face a mask of furious disbelief. "What the hell happened?" he roared, striding towards the broken machine, his expensive boots crunching on fallen fruit. He kicked at a loose piece of machinery, sending it skittering. "Get it fixed, now! We're losing product." A young mechanic, covered in grease, gingerly approached the damage. He poked and prodded, then straightened up, shaking his head. "Looks like something got in here, Mr. Miller." or something gave way. The bolts on this bearing, they were loose, almost like they were tampered with. Miller's head snapped up. His eyes, already narrowed with frustration, landed squarely on Kenji, who stood a few yards away, observing the scene with an almost clinical detachment. Kenji met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You," Miller barked, stalking towards him, his face flushed. "You got something to do with this, didn't you?" Kenji simply raised an eyebrow, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. "I was pruning Grove 4, Mr. Miller, like you asked. What makes you think I'd tamper with your equipment?" His voice was calm, steady, devoid of any defensiveness. It was this unnerving composure that seemed to inflame Miller further. "Don't play innocent with me, boy," Miller snarled, closing the distance until he was inches from Kenji, his breath hot with anger. "Things have been going wrong ever since you showed up. Little things. Now this is costing me thousands." He jabbed a finger at Kenji's chest, the movement aggressive. "You think you're clever? I'll tell you what's going to happen. You keep this up and you'll find yourself out of a job. Or worse. Understand?" Kenji didn't flinch. His gaze remained unwavering, fixed on Miller's eyes, a silent challenge in their depths. There was no fear, no anger, only an unsettling stillness that unnerved Miller more than any defiance could have. "I understand, Mr. Miller," Kenji said, his voice still low, almost a murmur. "I understand what you're saying, but I also understand this land. And I understand injustice." The last word, delivered with such quiet conviction, struck Miller like a physical blow. He recoiled slightly, a flicker of something akin to fear crossing his face, quickly replaced by a dangerous fury. He stared at Kenji, searching for a tell, a crack in the calm facade, but found nothing. Kenji was a stone. "Get back to work," Miller finally spat, his voice strained, a vein throbbing in his temple. "Before I make you regret ever stepping foot on my property." Kenji merely nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible curve to his lips that was less a smile and more a grim acknowledgement. He turned and walked away, leaving Miller seething, utterly discomfited. The harvest had truly begun, and Kenji, armed with the truth, knew that the rotten seeds planted decades ago were finally bearing fruit. The Millers had sown coercion and reaped despair. Now, they would harvest something far more potent. He had merely loosened a single bolt, but with Mateo's words ringing in his ears, Kenji felt a chilling clarity. This wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about exposing a festering wound, about bringing down an empire built on deception and desperation. The game had escalated, and Kenji was prepared to play for keeps. He just needed to find the next crucial weakness, the next vital artery to sever. And he already had an idea of where to look. The accounting books. The lingering scent of Miller's fury, acrid and metallic, clung to Kenji as he moved through the fields. It was a potent fuel, confirming his instinct. He'd struck a nerve. The old man's rage wasn't just bluster. It was the desperate thrashing of a cornered beast. Kenji's mind, sharp and tactical, had already moved past the confrontation, focusing on the next move. The accounting books. Miller's empire was a fortress, but every fortress, no matter how formidable, had its weak points. Kenji spent the rest of the day in a focused haze, mechanically working, his senses hyper-alert, observing routines, searching for a vulnerability. He knew Miller kept meticulous records, not for transparency, but for control. He needed access, a chink in the armor. It arrived that evening, tucked beneath the wiper of his borrowed truck. A simple folded square of heavy cream paper. No name, no return address, just a hastily scrawled message in precise, elegant script. "The Harvest Cafe, midnight, table in the corner. Come alone." Kenji's jaw tightened. A trap? Or an ally? The former felt too crude, too blunt for Miller's usual insidious tactics. This felt different, almost desperate. He debated, but the sheer audacity of the summons, the hint of clandestine urgency, piqued his interest. He had little left to lose, and perhaps everything to gain. He had already committed to dismantling Miller's empire. He couldn't afford to ignore any potential avenue. The Harvest Cafe was a relic, a diner long past its prime, smelling faintly of stale coffee and fried grease. Midnight cloaked it in an isolating hush. A single fluorescent light hummed over a scattered arrangement of tables. In the far corner, almost obscured by shadow, a woman sat, her back to the window. As Kenji approached, she turned, and his breath hitched. Sarah Miller, Mr. Miller's estranged daughter. The air in the cafe thickened, charged with an unspoken history. She looked like her father in the sharpness of her jawline, the intensity of her eyes, but where his features were etched with avarice, hers held a fragile intelligence, shadowed by something akin to weariness. Her clothes were simple, practical, a stark contrast to the tailored suits her father favored. She didn't offer a greeting, merely gestured to the opposite seat. "You came," she said, her voice low, raspy, as if unused to prolonged speaking. "You invited," Kenji countered, settling into the worn vinyl. He studied her, searching for answers. "What do you want, Ms. Miller?" Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "To burn it all down." She paused, her gaze steady, unflinching. "My father is a monster, Mr. Tanaka. I assume you're familiar with his work." "I am learning, yes," Kenji admitted, a sliver of cautious hope stirring within him. "And what does a Miller want with the ruins of her father's empire?" "Justice," she stated, the word hanging heavy in the air. "Or, failing that, at least to stop him from destroying anyone else's life, including his own. He's consumed." She reached into a large canvas bag beside her and pulled out a thick folder, pushing it across the table. "He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks he's God. But even gods can be brought low." Kenji opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents, bank statements, loan applications, property deeds. His eyes widened as he scanned the figures. Forged signatures, inflated property appraisals, loan applications listing crops that were never planted, never harvested. It was a labyrinth of financial deceit, designed to siphon money from banks, to leverage assets that were built on sand. The sheer audacity was staggering. He used these to secure massive loans against properties he didn't even legally own, Sarah explained, her voice gaining a sharp edge. He'd sweet-talk the banks, flash the family name, and then submit these fabricated figures. The land, the very soil, became his collateral, and every farmer's harvest, a twisted form of interest. "This explains so much," Kenji murmured, a cold anger seeping into his bones. It wasn't just exploitation. It was outright fraud. The theft wasn't just of labor, but of the land itself, using legal loopholes as thin veneers for blatant criminality. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "But that's not even the worst of it. The temporary leases, the ones given to the Japanese-American families after the war. My father didn't just exploit them. He orchestrated their permanence." Kenji looked up, a chill running down his spine. "What do you mean?" "He paid off Mayor Thompson, the old mayor, to amend the zoning laws to manipulate the land registry. Those temporary leases were never meant to be temporary for long. Thompson, a man with a gambling problem and a taste for expensive whiskey, changed their status through backdoor deals, making them functionally permanent transfers under a guise of agricultural development incentives. He then used his influence to ensure that any disputes over the land always favored my father. It was a conspiracy, Mr. Tanaka. A quiet, insidious coup, sanctioned by the very people sworn to uphold the law." The words hit Kenji like a physical blow. A local official, a mayor, colluding to strip land from returning internees, not just by opportunism, but by active criminal manipulation of the legal system. This wasn't just a powerful man taking advantage. This was the government turning a blind eye, facilitating the injustice, cementing a lie into law. The implications were horrifying. This was a direct betrayal of American citizens, a stain on the very fabric of justice, and it was so much more insidious than he could have imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" Kenji asked, his voice rough with suppressed rage. "Because you're the first person in years who's actually stood up to him," Sarah replied, a flicker of something almost hopeful in her eyes. "Because you're not afraid, and because I can't do it alone. He has eyes everywhere. He knows what you're doing, Mr. Tanaka. He's furious. And he's dangerous. What do you want me to do? Help me expose him. I have more. Receipts for payoffs, recordings of calls with his cronies, witness testimonies from former employees too scared to speak. He buried everything deep, but I dug it up. For years I've been chipping away, piece by piece building my own case. I just needed someone to help me finally bring it into the light. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent light. Kenji stared at the documents, then at Sarah. She was a miller, yes, but she was also a woman willing to betray her own blood for the sake of justice. An unholy alliance indeed, born of desperation and shared disgust. The stakes had just multiplied tenfold. As Kenji left the cafe, the night felt colder, more ominous. He knew Miller would not take any perceived challenge lightly. His every move would be watched. He felt a tremor of anticipation. Not fear, but a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The real fight. He didn't know how right he was. 2 days later, the trap sprung. Kenji was finishing his shift, meticulously packing the harvested crates, when a sharp voice cut through the afternoon calm. "Kenji Tanaka, freeze right there." He turned to see 2 deputies, their faces grim, stepping out from behind a Miller and Sons truck. Behind them, Mr. Miller stood, a triumphant, venomous smirk on his face, his gaze fixed on Kenji like a predator. "That's him, Sheriff," Miller drawled, gesturing with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "The thieving son of a bitch. Caught him red-handed, pilfering my supplies. Seen him with my own eyes, tucking away bags of fertilizer and seed. For weeks it's been happening. Just couldn't prove it till now." "Thieving?" Kenji stared, incredulous. "That's a lie." He hadn't taken so much as a single nail from Miller's property. "We have reports, Mr. Tanaka," one deputy said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Multiple witnesses, and Mr. Miller is pressing charges." "Witnesses? Who?" Kenji demanded, his mind racing. This was Miller's work, a desperate, clumsy attempt to discredit him, to remove him from the board. "Enough, Tanaka," Miller cut in, his voice dripping with false indignation. "You've caused enough trouble. Take him away, officers, and check his truck. I'm sure you'll find plenty of my property in there." The accusation was ludicrous, but the deputies were already moving. One headed for his truck, the other closing in on him. Kenji knew what would happen. They would find something planted by Miller's men. He would be arrested, charged, his credibility destroyed, his mission derailed. He couldn't let that happen. Not now, not when he was so close. His eyes darted, assessing the distance to the open field, the cover offered by the rows of ripening crops. He saw the flicker of understanding in the deputy's eyes, the moment before he made a move. "Don't even think about it," the deputy warned, reaching for his cuffs. But Kenji was already moving. He ducked under the deputy's outstretched arm, a swift, practiced movement born of years of quick reflexes in the fields and a childhood spent navigating tight spaces. He sprinted, a blur of motion, towards the nearest row of high corn, the stalks swaying in the breeze like complicit sentinels. "Stop him!" Miller roared, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. A shout, a scramble, the pounding of boots behind him. Kenji didn't look back. He ran, the taste of dirt and desperation in his mouth, the weight of Sarah's revelations urging him forward. He was now a fugitive, framed, running from the very law he sought to uphold. The unholy alliance had just been cemented in the most brutal way imaginable. He burst out of the cornfield on the far side, heart hammering against his ribs, the sounds of pursuit fading slightly behind him. But he was far from safe. He was alone, on the run, branded a thief, with a powerful, vengeful man now certain of his intentions. And somewhere, Sarah Miller was watching, a co-conspirator in a game that had just turned deadly. The harvest had indeed begun, and now Kenji was being hunted. The air in the derelict canning shed hung heavy with the scent of rust, decaying wood, and a faint, cloying sweetness of forgotten fruit. Kenji, bathed in the anemic glow of a battery-powered lantern, barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the scattered papers before him, each sheet a fragment of a truth the Millers had meticulously buried. He'd found the shed a mile beyond the cornfields, a forgotten relic of a bygone agricultural boom, its windows shattered, its corrugated roof groaning with every gust of wind. It was cold, damp, and perfectly isolated. For 3 days, he'd lived on the emergency rations he'd always kept in his truck, A truck now likely impounded, its presence a stark reminder of his new reality. He was a phantom, and every rustle outside, every distant siren, sent a jolt of ice through his veins. But fear was a distant hum beneath the roaring furnace of his resolve. Sarah's evidence was a labyrinth, but Kenji, with the instincts of a detective and the intimate knowledge of the land, began to map its twisted corridors. Ledgers, handwritten and pristine, documented phantom shipments of produce, their prices inflated, their destinations non-existent. Forged land deeds bore the clumsy signatures of elderly farmers long since deceased, their estates quietly absorbed into Miller's burgeoning empire. Loan agreements with predatory interest rates were disguised as charitable trusts, stripping struggling families of their last assets. He spread a series of photographs on the grimy workbench. Satellite images of fields clearly delineated as belonging to the 442 ND's trust, juxtaposed with official county records showing their ownership transferred to various shell corporations controlled by the Millers. He underlined specific dates, cross-referenced invoice numbers, and highlighted discrepancies in the official crop reports filed with agricultural agencies. Each red mark was a silent indictment, each highlighted passage a hammer blow against the Miller dynasty. This wasn't just about a technicality, about a land seizure that pushed legal boundaries. This was about cold, calculating theft, fraudulent insurance claims for phantom crop damage, the embezzlement of funds meant for community development programs, the outright deception of desperate people. The sheer audacity of it left a bitter taste in his mouth, a taste far worse than the stale protein bar he chewed on. He worked with a chilling focus, fueled by a potent cocktail of indignation and love. His parents, the faces of his community, the legacy of his ancestors. He imagined them, weary and displaced, their eyes holding a silent question. When, Kenji? When can we come home? He pulled out his burner phone, purchased months ago as a contingency for a different kind of crisis. It was a cheap, disposable model, but it held a single, crucial application he'd coded himself, an encrypted messaging client tied to a defunct online gaming forum. Only he and his parents knew the specific thread to monitor, the innocuous posts that held a hidden layer of meaning. His fingers, usually nimble in the fields, hesitated over the tiny keys. This was the most dangerous part, the most vulnerable. But he had to. He typed, "Harvest report. Weather improving. Yield is stronger than anticipated. We anticipate a full processing soon. Begin preparations for your return journey. Further details will follow." It was coded, yes, but the subtext was plain to them. "I have the evidence. The case is strong. Get ready. I'm bringing you home." He hit send, watched the small confirmation icon appear, then switched off the phone, burying it deep in his pack. A grim determination settled over him, heavier than the weight of the evidence. He was no longer just a man fighting for justice. He was a son, a soldier on a covert mission, and he would not fail. The air in the Miller dining room was as thick and unbreathable as a forgotten crypt. A crystal chandelier, usually a sparkling beacon of affluence, cast harsh, distorting shadows across the faces gathered around the polished mahogany table. Mr. Miller sat at the head, not eating, but shredding his linen napkin into meticulous, angry strips. His eyes, usually sharp, darted like trapped birds, scanning his wife, his son, and finally, settling on Sarah. "They're closing in," he rasped, his voice a frayed whisper. "The banks, the county, even some of those meddling journalists." He spat the last word like a curse. Someone's talking. Someone's feeding them information. Mrs. Miller, a woman whose every waking hour was dedicated to maintaining the illusion of perfection, dabbed nervously at her lips with a napkin that remained pristine. "Calvin, darling, perhaps it's just a misunderstanding." A clerical error, her voice trailed off under the weight of his furious gaze. A clerical error? He slammed a fist, not hard enough to break the expensive china, but enough to make it rattle violently. "No, Eleanor. This is deliberate, precise. Someone knew exactly what to look for." His eyes drilled into Sarah, who sat rigidly, her fork hovering over a piece of untouched salmon. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. "You've been spending a lot of time out there, haven't you, Sarah?" Miller's voice was low, laced with a venomous sweetness that made her stomach clench. "Out in the fields. With him. Her brother? Thomas. shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Father, Sarah was just working. Supervising the harvest. Supervising? Miller sneered, ignoring his son. Or perhaps conspiring? His gaze bore into Sarah, stripping away her composure layer by layer. You were seen, Sarah, with that Kenji Nakajima, before he became a fugitive, before he planted that phony evidence in my office. Sarah's breath hitched. She hadn't expected him to know so much, to piece it together so quickly. The cold certainty in his eyes was terrifying. He framed me, father, she blurted, a desperate, automatic defense. He tried to trick me. Did he now? Miller slowly rose from his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. He walked around the table, a predator stalking its prey. The clack of his leather shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the suffocating room. Because it looks to me like you've been working with him, feeding him information, betraying your own family. He was beside her now. Sarah flinched, pulling back as if scalded. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with years of unspoken resentment and power dynamics. I didn't, she began, her voice trembling. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his hand in a conventional slap. Instead, he reached out, a slow, deliberate movement, and clamped his hand around her chin, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her jaw. His grip was vice-like, his thumb pressing down on her windpipe, not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to make breathing a strained, painful effort. Her eyes bulged, tears blurring her vision. You viper, he whispered, his face inches from hers, his breath foul with wine and rage. After everything I gave you, after everything I built for you, you would tear it down for some savage who thinks he can reclaim what's ours. Mrs. Miller gasped, half rising from her chair. Thomas finally found his voice, a choked protest. Father, let her go. You'll hurt her. Miller didn't even glance at them. His eyes were locked on Sarah's, a terrifying blend of betrayal and possessive fury. No, son, he growled, his voice a low, chilling rumble that reverberated through Sarah's skull. She already hurt me, and now, she's going to pay the price for it. With a sudden, violent twist, he wrenched her head to the side, then released her with a shove that sent her chair skittering backward, Sarah tumbling to the floor. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the sharp gasp of Mrs. Miller and the ragged, choking sobs from Sarah, lying in a heap amidst the shards of broken crystal from a water glass that had fallen from the table. Mr. Miller stood over her, his chest heaving, a terrifying calm now settling on his face. He adjusted his cufflink, as if he had merely corrected a minor social faux pas. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice now dangerously soft, not just to Sarah, but to the entire room, to the very walls of his crumbling empire. I will find out who else is conspiring against me, and when I do, they will regret the day they were born. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, tapping a slow, ominous rhythm against the window panes. A storm was brewing, not just in the heavens, but in the dark, desperate heart of the Miller estate, and in the quiet, resolute hideout of a fugitive. The harvest was truly upon them, and its yields would be measured in blood and shattered lives. The storm that gathered outside the Miller estate that night was merely a prelude, a whispered promise of the tempest Kenji was about to unleash. In the cramped, damp confines of his hideout, a forgotten root cellar beneath the skeletal remains of an old barn on the edge of the Miller property, Kenji worked with a surgeon's precision. His hands, steady despite the tremor in his heart, arranged the damning photographs, transcribed the brittle, yellowed ledgers, and meticulously proofread the narrative he had painstakingly crafted. It was a story of systemic fraud, of the violent dispossession of Japanese-American families, of the Millers' insatiable greed built upon the ashes of shattered dreams. The target was Emily Thorne, a journalist known for her unyielding integrity and her uncanny ability to peel back the veneer of respectability from corrupt institutions. Her contact details, gleaned from months of surreptitious observation and whispered inquiries, were taped to the inside of a worn leather satchel. Kenji added the final piece, a handwritten note, brief and to the point, urging her to verify every detail, to follow every lead, for the truth of the 442 ND's harvest would not only expose a crime but reclaim a forgotten history. The package, sealed with multiple layers of wax and string, was delivered before dawn by a trusted intermediary, a former field hand whose family had also suffered under Miller's thumb. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced the rain-laden clouds, Kenji was back in his sanctuary, the silence heavy with anticipation. He knew what he had done was irreversible. The die was cast. The initial tremors began subtly, a faint rumble felt only by those attuned to the seismic shifts of public opinion. Then the ground began to shake. Emily Thorne's exposé hit the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle with the force of a thunderclap. The Stolen Fields. Miller's empire built on wartime deception, exploitation of interned families. The headlines screamed, the radio waves crackled. Details, chilling in their precision, painted a portrait of Mr. Miller not as the benevolent patriarch he presented himself to be, but as a ruthless opportunist who had preyed upon the vulnerability of a persecuted community. The documents Kenji had leaked were irrefutable. Forged land deeds, inflated relocation assistance forms, thinly veiled threats against families who dared to question the legitimacy of the Miller acquisition. Public outcry was immediate and furious. Letters to the editor poured in, demanding justice. Veterans organizations, still reeling from the sacrifices of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, voiced their outrage. Within days, a formal investigation by the state's Attorney General was announced. The comfortable walls of the Miller estate, once impenetrable, now felt porous, bombarded by an unseen enemy. Mr. Miller paced his study like a caged predator, the smell of stale whiskey and fear clinging to him. His face, usually a mask of controlled authority, was contorted with a grotesque blend of fury and panic. He slammed his fist on his antique desk, rattling the framed photographs of his ancestors. "This is a setup, a damn fabrication," he roared, but his voice cracked, betraying the tremor of doubt that gnawed at him. He suspected Sarah, but her broken spirit and the visible fear in her eyes during their last encounter made him question if she truly possessed the cunning for such an elaborate betrayal. He looked at Mrs. Miller, who sat silently, her face a pale canvas of terror, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Someone is trying to destroy us," he hissed, his eyes narrowed, scanning the room as if the betrayer was hiding in the shadows. "And I know where they'll have hidden their proof." His mind, sharpened by decades of ruthless dealings, cut through the fog of rage. The anonymous leak had to be someone intimately familiar with the farm, with his secrets. Someone who knew where the real documents, the ones he hadn't dared to destroy, were kept. He had hidden them years ago, not in his house, but in a false bottom of an old feed barrel in the abandoned, farthest barn, a place he believed no one would ever think to look. The memory of the original, unforged lease, tucked away for reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself, suddenly burned in his mind. He had to get rid of it. Late that night, under the cover of a renewed downpour, Miller slipped out. His hurried steps crunched on the gravel path, flashlight beam cutting a desperate swathe through the inky blackness. He moved with an urgency born of pure terror, each stride echoing the impending collapse of his world. Kenji, despite the aches that still plagued him from previous encounters, had been waiting. He had anticipated Miller's desperate move. He knew the man's twisted psychology, his need to control, to erase any trace of his crimes. The feed barrel was the only place Miller would consider safe enough, and therefore the most vulnerable. Kenji had rigged a simple tripwire leading to a small bell, a crude but effective alarm. As Miller's hand brushed against the taut string, the sudden jingle shattered the oppressive silence of the barn. Miller froze, breath catching in his throat. His flashlight beam swung wildly, catching Kenji emerging from the shadows, a crowbar clutched in his hand. "Miller," Kenji's voice was hoarse, but steady. "It's over." Miller's eyes, wide with disbelief and raw fury, settled on Kenji. "You!" he spat, a guttural sound of pure hatred. "You yellow rat! You think you can destroy me?" He lunged, a bull rushing a matador, not with grace, but with brute, desperate force. Kenji met him, raising the crowbar. The clang of metal against bone echoed through the barn as Miller's shoulder connected with the improvised weapon. Kenji grunted, the impact jarring his arm, but he held his ground. Miller, roaring, shoved Kenji back against a stack of moldering hay bales. The air filled with dust and the scent of decay. Miller was bigger, younger, fueled by a lifetime of entitlement and the adrenaline of a cornered beast. He grabbed Kenji, slamming him repeatedly against the wooden post of the barn frame. Pain exploded in Kenji's ribs, a sharp, white-hot agony that stole his breath. He tasted blood. But through the haze of agony, he saw Miller's free hand reaching for the feed barrel. Not that. He had to stop him. With a desperate surge of strength, Kenji twisted, bringing his knee up sharply into Miller's groin. Miller gasped, doubling over, momentarily incapacitated. Kenji seized the opportunity, shoving Miller aside and scrambling towards the barrel. His fingers, numb with pain, fumbled for the latch. Miller recovered with surprising speed, his face contorted in a mask of pure, murderous intent. He grabbed a rusty pitchfork leaning against the wall. The tines, sharp and unforgiving, glinted in the dim light. "You want to die for this old man?" he snarled, swinging the pitchfork in a wide, sweeping arc. Kenji ducked, but not fast enough. The outermost tine sliced across his arm, a searing stripe of pain. He cried out, stumbling, but refused to let go of the barrel. He wrestled the documents free, clutching the packet to his chest. He saw it, the folded, official-looking document different from the others. The lease. Miller, seeing the evidence in Kenji's grasp, screamed, a primal sound of utter defeat and rage. He lunged again, this time aiming for Kenji's chest. Kenji tried to dodge, but his injured arm gave way. The pitchfork struck with sickening force, not into his chest, but his leg, just above the knee. The world exploded in a kaleidoscope of pain. Kenji collapsed, the documents flying from his grasp, scattering across the dusty floor. He lay there, gasping, staring up at Miller's triumphant, demonic face. But then, Miller's eyes widened, not in victory, but in sudden, dawning horror. Kenji had seen it too. In his fall, his hand had closed around a loose floorboard. Beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was a small, lead-lined box. And in that box, tucked beneath a layer of old newspaper, was a single, leather-bound journal. It wasn't the documents he'd been after, not the forged ones Miller had intended to destroy. It was his journal, the one he thought he'd burned, detailing every single transaction, every threat, every sordid detail of his rise. And etched into the inside cover, a crude map leading to a separate, deeper cache. Miller's eyes locked onto the journal, then to Kenji's face. The full extent of Kenji's cunning, his long game, finally dawned on the farmer. He had been played, not just for the farm but for everything. You didn't just leak documents," Miller whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with a new, terrifying comprehension. "You led me here, to this." He pointed a trembling finger at the journal, then at Kenji's bloody hand, which still clutched a crumpled piece of paper, fallen from the original packet of evidence, a faded blueprint of the Miller farm, with a circled X. "What is that?" Kenji, panting, blood seeping through his trousers, managed a weak, triumphant smile. "That, Miller," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper, "is the true heart of your empire, the map to the very first lie. The real location of the original lease, signed and sealed, not by your hands, but by your grandfather's and stolen from the hands of my own." Miller took a step back, his face draining of color. The pitchfork fell from his grasp with a clatter. His eyes darted from the journal to the blueprint, then to Kenji's blood-soaked leg, his triumphant, defiant gaze. The rain intensified outside, hammering against the tin roof, drowning out the world. Kenji held the blueprint tighter, his vision blurring, the pain threatening to consume him. He had the proof, the final piece. But he also knew, as Miller's eyes narrowed, shifting from horror to a cold, predatory resolve, that the struggle for it had come at a price he might not live to tell. The first drops of rain, icy needles against Kenji's exposed skin, had been a prelude. Now, a torrential downpour lashed the Miller farm, turning the cultivated earth to slick mud and blurring the already fading light. Kenji stood in the mud-caked workshop, the old blueprint a fragile shield in his trembling hand, his injured leg throbbing with a rhythm that mimicked the thunder. Miller, a primal snarl twisting his face, lunged. The pitchfork, retrieved from where it had fallen, became a deadly extension of the farmer's fury. It swept down, a glinting arc aimed at Kenji's chest. Kenji, despite the pain screaming through his leg, moved with an instinct honed in combat, years of discipline overriding the raw agony. He twisted, the tines scraping his ribs, a shallow laceration blooming red against his soaked shirt. He stumbled back, the blueprint falling, dissolving into a pulpy mess in the mud. He hadn't needed it anymore. He knew the truth by heart. You ruined me," Miller roared, his voice thick with a desperate, animalistic rage. "You little gook. You took everything." The slur hit Kenji harder than any physical blow. It ripped open old wounds, older angers, memories of a generation dismissed, forgotten, then used and discarded. His blood pulsed with a cold, clear fury, sharper than the pain in his leg. Gook. The word echoed the insidious injustice that had stolen his family's land, had denied them dignity for generations. This wasn't just about the farm anymore. This was about them. All of them. Miller charged again, a wild beast cornered, desperate. Kenji, relying on years of military precision, anticipated the movement. He didn't have his left arm, a phantom ache, a constant reminder of his sacrifice, but his right was a piston of coiled muscle. As Miller swung, Kenji sidestepped, letting the momentum carry the larger man past him, then slammed his right elbow into Miller's exposed kidney. Miller gasped, a choked sound, staggering forward. The pitchfork clattered again as he bent double, struggling for breath. Kenji didn't wait. He moved, a predator himself now, using the very ground Miller owned against him. He swept his good leg low, tripping Miller, who landed with a splash in a muddy puddle, groaning. "This land," Kenji hissed, his voice raw, "is soaked with your lies, Miller, and it's going to wash you away." He pressed his advantage, ignoring the blinding pain in his thigh. He kicked the pitchfork away, sending it skittering into the darkness. Miller thrashed, grappling in the mud, trying to find purchase. Kenji seized him by the collar, dragging him up, his one arm surprisingly strong, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than any fever. He slammed Miller back against the sturdy trunk of an old apple tree, its branches heavy with ripening fruit. The impact shook a shower of water and apples onto their heads. Miller's eyes, wide and wild, met Kenji's. There was no longer fear, only a raw, terrifying desperation. He was an old man, out of his depth, his comfortable world collapsing. "You think this makes you a hero?" He spat, blood trickling from his lip. "You're a criminal, a mercenary." "I'm a soldier," Kenji corrected, his grip tightening. "And I'm reclaiming what was taken." His gaze swept across the orchard, the familiar rows of trees, the bounty that had sustained his family until Miller's grandfather had seen fit to steal it. This was the heart of the harvest, and he was taking it back. Miller, seeing the unyielding resolve in Kenji's eyes, suddenly shifted. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat. He lunged not at Kenji's face, but at his injured leg. He was aiming for the wound, a desperate, cowardly move. Kenji roared, a sound torn from the deepest part of his being, a primal cry of pain and outrage. He tried to pull back, but Miller's grip was iron, his desperation giving him unnatural strength. Miller twisted, sending a jolt of pure agony through Kenji's leg, threatening to buckle him. He fought to remain upright, to keep Miller from exploiting his weakness, but the world swam. Black spots danced before his eyes. Just as Kenji felt his strength wane, felt the insidious cold of defeat creeping in, a voice cut through the storm, sharp and clear. "Stop, both of you." It was Sarah. She stood at the edge of the orchard, illuminated by the bobbing beams of flashlights. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes soaked, but her stance was unwavering. In her hands, clutched carefully against her chest, was a clear, plastic-sealed document and a small, digital recorder. Miller froze, his head snapping up. Kenji, gasping for breath, saw her. Her eyes met his, a flicker of fear, but also a fierce determination. She had come. "Mr. Miller," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's over." She held up the document. The original temporary lease, signed by Kenji's grandfather, dated 1942, and here she clicked the recorder. A voice, reedy and aged, crackled through the downpour. amplified by the recorder's small speaker. Yeah, the Millers, they always had a way with papers. Said it was temporary, a wartime thing. Till the boys came home. But then they just kept it. My old man, he worked at the county office back then. Saw the original. Saw how they changed it. Paid off old man Thompson to lose the real one. Replace it with their forged deed. A few $1,000s, some land out east. Easy money for Thompson, hell for the Nishimura family. Kept their mouths shut, too. Hard to fight a war hero, especially when he owns the sheriff and half the town. The voice was that of Old Man Henderson, the retired county clerk Sarah had tracked down. The one Kenji had suspected held the last, damning piece of the puzzle. The rain seemed to intensify, washing over the shocking confession, making it feel less real, yet undeniably true. Before Miller could react, before Sarah could say another word, the wail of sirens pierced the stormy night. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, bathing the orchard in an eerie, pulsing glow. A fleet of vehicles, a mix of local sheriff's department cruisers and unmarked black SUVs, skidded to a halt at the edge of the farm. Sheriff Brody, looking grim and drenched, emerged from the first cruiser, followed by two stern-faced individuals in dark suits, federal agents. He strode towards them, his hand on his holstered weapon. "Mr. Miller," Brody's voice boomed, cutting through the rain. "Step away from him. You're under arrest. Forgery, fraud, assault, and attempted murder." Miller's face, already ashen, drained completely. He looked from Sarah to the recorder to the original lease, then to the armed law enforcement officers surrounding his property. His empire, built on lies and stolen dreams, was crumbling around him, brick by painstaking brick. His eyes, full of a desperate, cornered malice, finally landed on Kenji, still gripping his shoulder, holding him against the apple tree. Kenji, weak, bleeding, and trembling from exhaustion, stared back. The fury had not entirely dissipated, but beneath it, a profound weariness settled. The law of the jungle had brought him to this moment, had forced him to embrace a darkness he never wanted. But the truth, held by Sarah, delivered by Henderson, had arrived to legitimize his violent fight. As the federal agents moved in, their movements swift and practiced, Miller made one last, desperate lunge, not at Kenji, but away, a pathetic attempt to flee into the stormy night. But the agents were faster, stronger, and unburdened by pain. They tackled him, bringing him down into the mud he had sought to escape. Kenji watched, leaning heavily against the apple tree, the fight finally draining from his body. His leg gave out, and he crumpled to the wet ground, not caring about the mud or the rain. He had done it. He had reclaimed the land. Sarah rushed to his side, her face a mask of concern, dropping the evidence carefully before kneeling. "Kenji, are you all right?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He looked up at her, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He managed a weak smile, a flicker of triumph in his weary eyes. "The harvest," he croaked, "is finally done." But as he closed his eyes, the image of Miller's desperate, venomous face lingered. Justice had been served, yes, but the cost, the brutal, scarring cost of this victory, stretched before him. An unknown landscape he now had to navigate with one arm, a wounded leg, and a soul forever touched by the law of the jungle. What did it truly mean to win when you had to lose so much of yourself in the fight? The rain washed over him, blurring the distinction between victory and profound loss, leaving only the chilling question of what kind of man he would be when the storm finally passed. The air, even weeks later, still smelled of rain-soaked earth and a faint metallic tang Kenji couldn't quite shake from his senses. He lay in a sterile hospital bed, the clean sheets a stark contrast to the mud and blood of the orchard. His arm was encased in plaster, a rigid white monument to the battle, and his leg, though healing, throbbed with a persistent ache. Sarah was a constant presence, her quiet strength a balm, her eyes reflecting a weariness that mirrored his own. The news had spread, a slow burn across the valley, then a wildfire across the state. The Millers, a family once thought untouchable, were facing a barrage of federal charges. Fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and more. The government, shamed into action by Sarah's meticulously gathered evidence and the raw, undeniable spectacle of what had transpired on the Kenji farm, had moved with uncommon speed. There was no local bias now, no old boys club to shield them. The Millers were caught in a federal net, one they had woven themselves with decades of quiet corruption. Justice, Kenji thought, was a capricious beast. It had slept for too long, only to awaken with a hungry roar once a man had taken matters into his own hands. The first rays of true autumn sunlight filtered through the hospital window when the telegram arrived. Not for Kenji directly, but through Sarah, addressed to the Kenji family. His parents were being released. Tomorrow. The word hung in the air, heavy with 1,000 unspoken questions. The drive to Manzanar was long and silent, Sarah at the wheel, Kenji a silent, aching passenger. The landscape, barren and unforgiving, mirrored the desolation of their journey. When they finally pulled up to the gate, the camp still loomed, a stark, brutal monument to fear and prejudice. He saw them first, two figures emerging from the barracks, silhouetted against the dusty plains. His mother, stooped, her once vibrant kimono faded to a dull whisper of its former self. His father, gaunt, his shoulders slumped, carrying a small, worn valise. They looked like ghosts, like shadows cast by a sun that had forgotten how to warm. The reunion was not the joyous burst of emotion Kenji had envisioned 1,000 times in the trenches. It was a silent, trembling affair. His mother, Emiko, ran a hand over his bandaged arm, her eyes filling not with tears of relief, but with a profound, bone-deep sorrow that transcended words. His father, Hiroshi, simply looked at him, his gaze sweeping over Kenji's injuries, then landing on Sarah, a silent question in his aged eyes. Sarah, ever graceful, introduced herself, explaining the long, winding path that had led them here. "The farm, it's ours again," Kenji finally managed, his voice hoarse. "The Millers are gone." His father merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. There was no exultation, no loud declaration of triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a wound that had festered for too long, finally lanced, but leaving a jagged scar. They drove back to the valley in silence, the weight of their collective trauma filling the space between them. When they turned down the familiar dirt road, the site of their home, the Kenji farm, was a punch to the gut. The vibrant apple trees were overgrown, laden with unpicked fruit now rotting on the branches or littering the ground, attracting wasps. The fields were a tangled mess of weeds, the farmhouse paint peeling, windows streaked with grime. It was a corpse of a farm, a skeleton of what it once was, mirroring the internal landscape of its owners. Emiko gasped, a soft, choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Hiroshi closed his eyes, his face etched with an agony Kenji understood deeply. This wasn't the triumphant return to a restored Eden. It was a homecoming to a mausoleum of lost time, a stark reminder of everything stolen. That evening, as Sarah cooked a simple meal in their neglected kitchen, the silence in the farmhouse was deafening. Kenji sat across from his parents, his bandaged arm resting on the table, a constant reminder of the fight. He saw the questions in their eyes, not just about the farm, but about him. What had happened to their son, the boy who went to war? He was a man now, yes, but one forged in a different kind of fire, scarred by a different kind of enemy. Later, under the vast, uncaring blanket of stars, Kenji walked out to the orchard. He stood amidst the skeletal trees, the air cool and crisp. The smell of decaying apples was potent, a bitter perfume. He touched the rough bark of a tree, tracing the lines of a branch he'd known since childhood. This tree, like him, had survived, but it bore the marks of neglect, of battle. He closed his eyes, the memory of Miller's desperate face, the cold calculations, the choices he'd made washing over him. He had chosen the law of the jungle when institutional justice failed. He had become the animal, stalking his prey, dismantling his enemy piece by piece. There was a raw, primal satisfaction in it, a dark truth he could not deny. He had won. He had reclaimed his family's legacy. But at what cost? He felt the phantom pain in his arm, the ache in his leg, but more profoundly, the emptiness in his soul. Had he truly won, if in the process, he had become a version of the very darkness he fought against? He had brought justice, yes, but he had also brought violence, and a trauma that would forever reshape him. A soft rustle drew his attention. His father stood a few paces away, a silent sentinel. Hiroshi looked at the farm, then at his son, his eyes finally meeting Kenji's. "The soil, it needs turning," Hiroshi said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper against the night. "Needs new seeds." Kenji looked at his father, a man who had endured unimaginable indignity, who had lost everything but his quiet dignity. Hiroshi hadn't asked about Kenji's methods, hadn't judged the blood on his hands. He spoke of the earth of renewal. "Yes, father," Kenji replied, the words a promise, a vow. "New seeds." He looked out over the darkened fields, the forgotten rows, the silent orchard. The harvest of stolen land was complete. But the true harvest, the one of healing, of rebuilding, of restoring trust not just in his family, but in a fractured community, a country that had betrayed them, that harvest was only just beginning. It would be a long, arduous process, fraught with memory and pain. But as Kenji stood there, a man forever changed, he felt a flicker of something new, something fragile yet potent, rising within him. Not the vengeful fire of the jungle, but the steadfast warmth of a farmer's hope. He would turn the soil, plant the seeds, and ensure that the next harvest would not just be of fruit, but of true freedom, true belonging. He raised his one good hand, and in the gesture, he was no longer a soldier or an avenger. He was a farmer, a son, standing ready to face the long, difficult dawn.